Hello, everyone, and welcome to All Things Politics. I'm your host, Bub. Let's get right to it. Deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. There seems to be a lot of talk around DNA, but especially the DNA of the melanated people. Uh, we should all find this interesting, but more so, it should be more interesting and thought provoking when we hear it from our own that speak about it. Now, when we hear other, you know, people, professors, so to speak, about DNA, there's always something being left out. And there's a reason for that, of course. But when we listen to our own speak about DNA, especially the DNA of melanated people, we always learn something new and something different, something special about our DNA. Um, is there, I think that there's always or has always been a concerted effort to minimize or uh, the DNA of melanated people, or to make as though all DNA of all ethnicities is the same. That's not true. Um, I got a clip I want to share with you guys. I think it's very pertinent to what I just talked about. Uh, DNA is something very, very significant. And were it not for the miseducation of the melanated people, we'd have a great understanding as to what our DNA is capable of, what it has in it, and how it is able to not only sustain us, but give us an ability to be better human beings, for lack of a better term or phrase. Okay, I want to share this with you guys, and hopefully it brings or sheds light on the issue of DNA.
There was a banned study that was supposed to be stored in vaults, locked forever. However, this study got leaked, and it's related to black DNA. What radioactive it can have is beyond our understanding. And whatever we have been told about black people, their origin, their intelligence, and their capability, no one expected the truth to come from a laboratory basement. No one imagined that a forgotten research file, locked away, mislabeled, and quietly buried, could shake the very foundation of American history. Yet,
Well, I have to jump in here. A lot of what we say been lost or misplaced somewhere was something in most cases, especially when we're talking about ethnicity, done purposely. Uh, it, it it reminds me of a skit Richard Pryor did on a Saturday Night Live where he and three or four other white archaeologists come across a pyramid. And inside this pyramid were these sarcophagus and this old tomb, this old volume, a book that was very old. And in the book was descriptions of who we were and what we contributed, to civilization, so on and so forth. So as Richard Pryor got to talking about, oh, I can't wait to get out and tell the brothers about this. Oh my God, I knew it. We knew it. We've been knowing it. While he's going through this, right, he's just so excited, and what we call, a lot of people call us being emotional. What we call, though, some of us being passionate about something, especially when we have an idea of what we're being passionate about. His white counterparts were easing out of out of the tomb, and shutting and locked him inside. So that way, that information would have never will never get out, and that's how I liken a lot of excuses, or a lot of how others in society say, oh well, it was misplaced, or oh well, it didn't matter, or hey, we just don't know where it is. Truth of the matter is, they do. All right. There that is. Here you go, people.
And here we are. A leaked, unpublished DNA study, dismissed, shelved, and later erased, has resurfaced. Inside it lies a finding so explosive that it sent shockwaves through the small circle of geneticists who saw it. A result so disruptive that some researchers allegedly warned each other never to speak of it again, because
there you go. That's exactly what I'm talking about. The genetic ancestry of African Americans, Latinos, and
the study suggested something unthinkable. Black Americans might not be who textbooks insist they are. Not only descendants of enslaved African, but carriers of a genetic signature that appears in places it should not exist, in ancient indigenous remains, pre-Columbian burial sites, and isolated lineages predating European arrival. The reaction was immediate. Panic, silence, suppression, and it forces one question. What did this DNA study uncover so powerful, so politically explosive that it had to be buried? In this video, let's find out.
The Black History Archives.
For most Black Americans, the official story of their past has been handed down in a straight, brutal line. Africa, ships, slavery, America. It is the diagram you see in school textbooks.
Let me stop right quick and pay homage to the Black History Archives, courtesy of the Black History Archives, for allowing me to use this clip. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. All right, let's get back to this.
The timeline repeated in documentaries, the narrative baked into national memory. Your story begins with capture, with chains, with bodies thrown into the hull of a ship and transported across an ocean to labor on plantations. From there, history moves through emancipation, Jim Crow, civil rights, and the modern era of mass incarceration and racial inequality. It is a story true in its pain, but narrow in its scope. It treats Black existence as something that began when Europeans decided it mattered. What gets erased in that version is everything that existed before the ship. The centuries where African empires rose and fell, where scholars debated astronomy and mathematics, where traders and sailors traveled long distances, and where different continents touched each other long before Europe imagined itself the center of the world. It also erases the indigenous side of the story. The tribal nations in the Americas that had their own complex relationships, conflicts, and alliances, some of which may have intersected with Africans and others in ways that history barely records. That erasure isn't just an accident of poor record keeping. It serves a purpose. If Black people are seen as having arrived in America only as property, then the systems built on that idea, like land ownership, citizenship, racial categories, and legal rights, are.
This is a conversation I have with a lot of people, a lot of our brothers and sisters. How did we get here? For most of us, we tend to believe the story told that we got here on slave ships in bondage. There are others of us who know that we were here way before that ever occurred. And others still who say we are the indigenous people of this land. The thing is, though, anytime we tend to have these discussions with our brothers and sisters, there's always conflict as a result of the conversation. Disagreement is fine, but conflict is something, something else. It's of another nature. Mostly what ensues is violence, not just disagreement, but violence in dislike, disdain, or even hatred. We've talked, like I said, on numerous occasions about our arrival here. Who was here first? The slave or the indigenous African? Was the Mexican here first? Was the Mayan here first? Were Europeans here first? And did we only arrive here when they got here? These are discussions, like I said, we have quite frequently on another channel I have called Under the Groove Podcast. We talk about these things in a segment we titled Touching Bases with the People. It's hard for a lot of us to discern or even come to understand that, okay, we were here before slaves arrived, and that's only because of the indoctrination of the misinformation given to us. So to hear anything different is kind of, it's almost blasphemous. It's like telling people, okay, well, Jesus was just a man, or there's no God but the white man's God, and it's not real. To say this to those who believe or have faith in those sort of things is blasphemous. They would never agree with you. They would never agree with you. They would never even open their minds to try to get the understanding you have, or, to allow themselves to be put into a place mentally to where they can go and then research a lot of the information that is now starting to come forth. It's a sad thing that we cannot communicate with one another, no matter what the issue or topic is. There's always disagreement, and as a result of disagreement, there is a division that ensues to the point where communication is cut off. So if I'm a Muslim and you're a Christian, there's really no conversation, because we both worship or have faith in different gods. Neither one willing to take the time to try to understand another's aspect or reasoning or teachings. Sadder still are those individuals, those two individuals just described, not willing to hear the outside part of it, the part that's not in the middle. To hear such things is, again, would be considered blasphemous, or you are an atheist, or you are agnostic, or you're just a heathen, something to that effect, paganist or something. But the fact is, because there's no communication, and because most of everything we know has been disseminated to us, indoctrinated in us in such a way that when knowledge is being offered or education is being offered, it's rejected, because we are so indoctrinated with what came before, not just us, but all of our ancestors previous to us. And I think this is sad. This affects not just the individual, but it affects the community. It is something that is, to this day, a divider. Just getting to understand where we come from is difficult. It's difficult to reach the same level of understanding or education, because we have been so miseducated. All right.
Are easier to justify. It becomes simpler to argue that Black people have no original claim to the land, no pre-slavery presence to acknowledge, no deeper roots to respect. When you define a people's origin as slavery, you quietly deny their prior sovereignty. This is where the Black DNA study steps into the story as something quietly explosive. Unlike school curricula or government archives, genetic evidence doesn't ask for permission before it speaks. It doesn't soften its conclusions to protect national myths. It doesn't bend itself to ideology. However, to understand why talk of a banned Black DNA study causes such shockwaves, we first need to be clear about the current scientific baseline. Within mainstream population genetics, the consensus today is straightforward. There is no widely accepted, robust evidence that large, stable African populations were living across the Americas before Columbus. That doesn't rule out isolated voyages, temporary contacts, or small groups arriving earlier. It simply means that, so far, the kinds of replicated, high-quality data required to rewrite global migration models have not been established to the satisfaction of most experts. But that does not mean the picture is simple or settled. In the 1990s and 2000s, as techniques for extracting and sequencing ancient DNA improved, researchers working on indigenous remains from the Americas began to encounter results they did not entirely expect. A small number of samples showed outlier haplogroups, genetic signatures that did not line up neatly with the typical Native American lineages traced back to ancient Asian ancestors. In a few cases, these sequences looked more similar to patterns seen today in sub-Saharan Africa or North Africa. Officially, many of these anomalies were written off as contamination. Ancient DNA work is notoriously delicate. A single modern cell introduced during excavation, storage, or lab processing can distort the result. From a technical standpoint, calling these cases contamination is plausible, and in some instances, it may well be correct. Yet the speed with which such findings were folded into the category of error without much appetite to investigate further left behind a lingering question. Were these genuinely mistakes and nothing more? Or were some of them quietly dismissed because they complicated an already politically sensitive story?
The latter. Excuse me. I said the latter, intentionally socked away, intentionally hidden. You can pretty much come up with the reason or purpose for that. But there's no doubt in a lot of our minds that we are way more than something described as a slave or people known to be in bondage. Greater still is, the supposition that we were here way before the Mayflower landed or Europeans established a colony here. Artifacts exist to this day that very few can actually explain, especially when it comes to the features of these artifacts, these relics. Couple that with the fact that there are pyramid structures, not just in South America, but North America as well. And there are some who find it conveniently easy to explain away the reason for their being here. And I say explaining away, nicely, all right?
At roughly the same time, a handful of universities generated internal reports or preprints claiming unexpected sub-Saharan signatures in skeletal remains dated to pre-Columbian periods. None of these studies made it through major peer-reviewed journals. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community and we need your support. Let's continue now.
Let me throw mine in there, my hat in that ring. This is All Things Politics. I am your host. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to this channel so that we also can bring insightful information and education to the people. That's all we ask. We appreciate your viewership.
Critics pointed to small sample sizes, weak methodology, or poor controls. Supporters argued that, while imperfect, the findings deserve deeper exploration. Behind the scenes, some researchers admitted that even being associated with such a controversial subject could damage their careers. This is the paradox. A study can be scientifically flawed and politically dangerous at the same time. The pressure not to touch it grows, regardless of whether it is true, false, or somewhere in between. Before genetics, physical anthropologists tried to read ancestry from bones alone. In the early 20th century, some claimed that particular skulls or facial structures from ancient American sites showed African-like characteristics. Later scholarship largely rejected these conclusions, arguing that cranial shape is a poor and unreliable proxy for continental origin. Those early debates never completely disappeared. They now hover in the background whenever new evidence hints at connections outside the accepted model.
The old playbook is still in effect. Everything that they did back then, they still do today. Most of what they said back then, they still say today. It hasn't changed.
Overlay this with indigenous oral histories, and the picture gets more layered. Several native nations in North America preserve stories of dark-skinned peoples present before Europeans arrived, sometimes described as allies, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as groups eventually absorbed into the tribe. Historians often categorize such accounts as symbolic or mythic, not literal migration records. Yet many indigenous people insist these stories refer to real communities, not abstractions. Put together, all of this leaves us in a complicated middle ground. There are enough anomalies, sideline studies, contested skull interpretations, and persistent oral traditions to make the question deeply uncomfortable. If even a single lineage could be shown with strong evidence to predate European arrival, the consequences for how we understand history, anthropology, and law would be enormous. That possibility alone is enough to make certain institutions nervous, and it is in that climate that whispers about a banned Black DNA study began to circulate. The whispers surrounding the so-called banned DNA study describe a project that examined hundreds of ancient skeletal remains from archaeological sites across North America, dating from roughly 700 to 3,000 years before the present. The study has never been officially released. No peer-reviewed publication exists. The authors have remained silent, and no outside scientist has been given access to the raw sequencing data or laboratory methods. What survived?
That is a cover-up. That is definition of a cover-up right there. An erasure. Pisses you off.
Survives are fragments, accounts from individuals who claim they saw early presentations, internal draft slides, or incomplete manuscripts. These fragments form the basis of three controversial claims. The first claim centers on the Y chromosome, the genetic material passed from fathers to sons. Several of the male remains reportedly carried a lineage known as E1B1A, a signature haplogroup found widely today in West and Central Africa. This lineage is common among sub-Saharan African populations and also among many African-descended communities in the Americas whose ancestors were brought through the transatlantic slave trade. If this same haplogroup were reliably detected in remains that lived centuries before 1492, it would challenge the widespread belief that African genetic presence in the Americas began almost entirely with European transported enslaved Africans. It would raise the possibility that some African-linked lineages were present long before Columbus, something mainstream academic models do not currently accept. The second claim involves mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal ancestry. Some of the ancient samples reportedly contain sequences resembling haplogroups typical of ancient African or North African populations, rather than the lineages usually associated with pre-contact indigenous groups in North America. This finding alone would not constitute definitive proof of pre-Columbian African settlement, especially given how easily ancient samples can be contaminated. But if verified under strict scientific scrutiny, clean labs, replication, and contamination controls, it would support the idea that a small but genuine African-related maternal presence may have existed in certain regions before European colonization. The third key claim concerns geography. The reported genetic anomalies were not scattered randomly across the continent. Instead, they clustered along the Gulf Coast and into the lower Mississippi Valley. These regions later became the homeland of thriving indigenous civilizations, and much later, areas where many native-descended communities were reclassified by government record keepers as colored, mulatto, or black. This bureaucratic reclassification stripped native communities of legal recognition and land rights, even as the people themselves remained physically present. Thus, the genetic clustering described in the alleged study overlaps suspiciously with regions where historical identities were deliberately overwritten. If even a small portion of these findings were validated through rigorous, transparent scientific review, the implications would be far-reaching. It would suggest that some individuals categorized solely as African American today may also be direct biological descendants of pre-Columbian indigenous populations of North America. This would shift our historical identity from being understood only as descendants of forced arrivals to being, at least in part, members of lineages rooted on this land long before European ships arrived. Even without complete proof, the idea alone destabilizes core assumptions about ancestry, belonging, and national origin stories. That is why, according to the Whispers, the study provoked fear, pressure, and a quiet decision within institutions to avoid public scrutiny instead of encouraging open debate. Tell us, if your ancestors weren't just brought here, but were already here, what does that make you now?
What does that make you now? I think that when we're dealing with ethnicity, or nowadays everybody wants to say race, when we're dealing with genetics, no doubt there is, and I don't mean to sound biased, but I'm a Black man, and I truly know that there is a genetic superiority linked to us more than anyone else. I think this is the fear. This is the threat. It isn't just the threat of putting it out there, letting the information be known that this is, let's say, a genetic fact, but the fear that something would occur to them as a result of melanated people coming into the know of who they are and their superiority, you know what I mean? No longer thinking inferior, thinking in terms of greatness, nothing less. That's the fear, and that would also spur the fear of saying, no, don't let that out. Or, the concerted effort to keep certain information, especially genetic information, racial information, under wraps. It is because to allow that information out, especially to a people who have been denigrated, abused, murdered, enslaved, creates a fear in those who've done these things, a fear that it chills them to their bone. It puts a fear that there will be retribution. I think that's it. Couple that with the fact that were this to be known, were we in a position to know just how genetically superior we are, that they would lose the lie. They won't be able to stand on that lie anymore, that they are superior. And along with that being exposed as inferior genetically, they lose everything else, everything that's come with it, everything that comes with it. So this is why we see what we see. This is why education, as important as it is, and we know why it's so important, but this is why education has not been afforded or even early on allowed amongst the melanated people. It would mean their demise. In their minds, it would mean their demise, So I just wanted to drop that piece about DNA. I think it's important that things of this nature are discussed, not just genetics, but our history is another, our gifts, and the fact let me backtrack. Our DNA represents something that scares people. You know, I tend to term it the God gene. I tend to speak about our DNA as the DNA, the only DNA that has the God gene. You know, our genetics, you know, are related to or come from, you know, the highest power, the highest power. I don't need to attach some supernatural being to it, but just say and hope that what I'm saying is enough. A higher power, a higher force. That's where we come from. You know, our DNA is exceptional. There's no doubt about it. Facts. That being said, I appreciate your time. This is All Things Politics. I am your host, Bub. We'll be back with more content for you. We appreciate you watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to this channel so that we can continue to do the good work. Thank you for your time. Take care of yourself and each other.